Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Doug Lynham, and today we are going to talk about the lost psychedelic history of the Enneagram. Now, the history of the Enneagram is convoluted, complicated, because the Enneagram comes to us through a variety of religious traditions and spiritual practices over the millennia. Trying to pin down who first discovered it is like trying to pin down who discovered that 2 + 2 = 4. And we find traces of it in ancient Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, some of the early Christian writings. So it's coming to us from a lot of different schools of thought, and it really didn't get synthesized into its modern form until the middle of the 20th century with two pioneers. One was Oscar Chazo, who was a Bolivian philosopher, and Claudio Naranjo, a Chilean psychiatrist. They're sort of like the Galileo and Newton for the Enneagram. Just as Galileo and Newton took, what was the extant knowledge about physics of their time, and together their combined efforts gave us this really powerful tool for understanding the physical world. In the same way, Chazo and Naranjo developed the Enneagram into its modern form to really codify it and give us the powerful tool that we have today. And Chazo, you could say, sort of really put the bones of the skeletal structure of the Enneagram into a robust form that Naranjo would then later come along and put kind of the meat and the connective tissues on those bones to really flesh it out and make it the practical tool for psychological and spiritual development that we have today. And of course, there's many, many other contributions, hundreds, if not thousands of people who've added to the wisdom of the Enneagram over the ages and millennia, but those are some of the big standouts. And there's sort of the elephant in the room that I've never seen anybody talk about in the Enneagram community is the role that psychedelics played in its discovery. It's sort of like this awkward family secret that nobody mentions at Thanksgiving dinner. And so, before Timothy Leary really turned psychedelics into a cultural hand grenade in the 1960s, they were a really serious tool for scientific and psychiatric research. And unfortunately, all of that got shut down when Nixon waged his war on drugs and put things like all the psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, mushroom, MDA, ketamine, all these things got lumped automatically into the Schedule I category within the FDA that put them in the same category as heroin. So suddenly that shut down what was a very promising and robust psychological and scientific exploration of these substances. But what we know about Chazo, if we look at the history of these two pioneers, Chazo, Naranjo, and even Gurdjieff, who is a predecessor to the two of them, all of them were psychonauts. What we call a psychonaut is someone who, like an astronaut, right, explores space. Psychonauts who are interested in exploring the inner world of human consciousness. And all of those three pioneers in the Enneagram were undeniably hardcore psychonauts. They were exploring with these mind-altering substances quite extensively. If we start with George Gurdjieff, who kind of introduced Chazo apparently to the Enneagram in a very sort of generalized form. He was known extensively to use mind-altering drugs on himself and even on his students. This is back in the 1800s before any of this stuff was illegal. But then comes around Chazo, who spent considerable time exploring consciousness through traditional shamanic practices in South America, where he was born and raised, including working with mescaline, peyote, ibogaine, ayahuasca, as well as LSD. And his first psychedelic journey occurred on ayahuasca at the age of 13, which is shocking. I wouldn't recommend anyone doing psychedelics at that early of an age. But nonetheless, these experiences really helped shape his understanding of the 9 personality types within the Enneagram and the core motivations. Think of these psychedelics as sort of like psychedelics are to understanding human consciousness, much like a telescope or a microscope are to exploring the physical world. They can let us really delve into a level of depth and both expansiveness and depth that we don't normally have in our daily normal waking consciousness or normal consciousness in a non-altered state. But nonetheless, we know that, what was it? Excuse me, I'm gonna look at my notes here, make sure I'm getting this right. Then it was Naranjo who really took this research to a whole new level. So Chazo was a little more not as open, I would say, with his psychedelic explorations, although he actually helped to write what's called a movie called The Holy Mountain. It's considered a psychedelic masterpiece. It gets like 7.5 out of 10 on Rotten Tomatoes reviews. I don't think it deserves that high of a rating, but nonetheless, the director, writer, and the producers and the staff all went down to the Eureka, and the cast went down to the Eureka Institute and spent 3 months with Echazo there. And it was Echazo who encouraged the director, Jarovsky, I think was his name. So I can't quite get his name right. Forgive me for not pronouncing that correctly. But anyway, Echazo was one who encouraged the director of this film to experiment with LSD and really introduced him to that substance. But it was really Naranjo who took everything to a whole new level. And in his research, so Naranjo ran, as a psychiatrist, a psychedelic-assisted therapy clinic in South America for years, for decades. And he partnered with Alexander Shulgin, who's known as the godfather of psychedelics. Now, together with Shulgin, they helped develop and test over 100 different psychoactive compounds. And Naranjo even became the first Westerner to document ibogaine effects, and he earned recognition as a shaman from the indigenous Tatas tribe. And Claudio Naranjo personally experimented. He documents this in his books. He worked with psilocybin, marijuana, mescaline, a bunch of compounds I haven't even heard of: TMA-1, TMA-2, LSD, MDA, MDMA, MMDA, MMDA-3A, whatever that is, DMMDA, harmaline, iboga, ayahuasca, ketamine, 10-MeO harmaline, and my personal favorite is 5-MeO DMT. Now these are some credentials you're not going to get from LinkedIn Learning. You're not going to hear about this stuff in much of the traditional history of the Enneagram. And Naranjo was remarkably transparent about his psychedelic explorations, because he really is. The thing about Naranjo is he's undeniably the godfather, the great wise elder of the Enneagram community. We trace so much of what we think of as the Enneagram today back to Naranjo's work. But Naranjo is also the godfather for the psychedelic renaissance that we're currently in. He sparked both movements, and at some point they sort of splintered and they took very different paths and got separated from each other. And it's sort of my intent with this video to try to bring these two streams of thought back into union in the mainstream consciousness of both the psychedelic community and the Enneagram community. Now, Naranjo wrote two interesting books. If you don't believe, people in the Enneagram community are probably freaking out right now, going, what craziness is this guy talking about? But don't believe me. Check out Naranjo's book. It's called My Psychedelic Explorations: The Healing Power and Transformational Potential of Psychoactive Substances. And then he also wrote another book called The Healing Journey, and that's pioneering. See this up there. Pioneering approaches to psychedelic therapy, where he lists his all of his treatment notes and lists case studies, and it's a very interesting book to take a look at, how he really lays the groundwork for what now we think of as psychedelic assisted therapy. Now, one of the interesting, I'll come back to this in a minute, but one of the questions that comes to mind is like, well, why did the psychedelic movement and the Enneagram movement become so disconnected? And I think in part it was because of how, and this is a hypothesis, is how the Enneagram was introduced to the U.S. So as the story goes, it was Naranjo ran a retreat for about 12 Jesuit priests and taught them the Enneagram as a tool, what we call the discernment of spirits in First Corinthians. And basically it spread through these 12 Jesuit priests out into religious and monastic communities around the U.S., and then slowly found its way moving out into mainstream culture through the Christian movement. And it would be understandable why these Jesuits, first of all, Naranjo would probably have downplayed the psychedelic connection with this audience, and more importantly, why that audience wouldn't really want to look too deeply because into the psychedelic history of the Enneagram, in part because they were struggling really hard to get the Enneagram itself accepted into mainstream Christianity. Many Christians in the evangelical, not necessarily the evangelical movement, but more in the fundamentalist movement, which aren't necessarily the same thing, find great take umbrage with the Enneagram and are always looking for ways to poke holes in it and discredit it. So these Jesuits were trying to bring the Enneagram, give it a theological justification in the Christian communities that they were bringing it back to, and probably it was probably just a non-starter for them or for the people they were talking to. So they either ignored the psychedelic history of the Enneagram or they suppressed it. Take your pick. I'm not much for conspiracy theories. I suspect they just kind of glossed it over, and no one else seems to be picking this story up. But one of the interesting facts about how Naranjo's influence in the psychedelic world beyond the Enneagram world is that it was this book, The Healing Journey, that Naranjo wrote around, I think, in 1973, it fell into the hands of a teenager at the age of 18 whose name was Rick Doblin. And if you know that name, then you will understand where I'm going with this. But Rick Doblin would then go on. This book lit a fire under him, and he then went on to found what's known as MAPS. MAPS is a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies. And MAPS is the leading nonprofit research institution for psychedelics in the US. It really is to psychedelics what NASA is to space exploration. And actually had the honor to attend the 2023 MAPS conference in Denver, which was really quite remarkable. I was expecting a bunch of whacked out hippies, and it looked more like a convention of the United Nations. There were leaders from all over the world, including there were generals from the military there. There were leaders from the pharmaceutical industry were there. The medical community had in robust attendance. And two of the keynote speakers, one was Jared Polis, the then Democratic governor of Colorado, and Rick Perry, the former Republican governor of Texas. Both gave really powerful keynote speeches at that MAPS conference about how important psychedelic research is, particularly for helping with PTSD and trauma in our military veterans, first responders, and police force. And so that was really quite remarkable. And the research backing all of this up isn't coming from some tie-dye lab. It's actually coming out of places like Harvard, Johns Hopkins, NYU, and many, many other leading prestigious academic institutions around the world have entire departments now dedicated to psychedelic studies, because the efficacy of these medicines, when used appropriately in the appropriate set and setting, have shown to be extremely powerful and effective for helping people uncover their unconscious traumas, even their conscious traumas, of course, and finding healing and peace in their personal life. And many of us could testify to the effects they've had, the positive effects they've engendered in the spiritual practices for many of us. And for me, I kind of came late to the party. My first psychedelic experience of any substance really wasn't until I was 43 in 2017. And I first encountered mushrooms right when I left the monastery. And that was a really difficult time in my life, because I was a monk for 20 years, and I joined the monastery with really good intentions, and some of those were fulfilled. A lot of them were not. But let's just say there was a significant amount of abuse that happened in my monastic time, during my time in the monastery, a tremendous amount of emotional abuse, and including sexual and physical abuse, that when I left the monastery, I was very much in a very broken space, because not only was I dealing with the trauma that I was leaving behind, but I also left the entire world that I knew about. I left my career, I left my family, I left my friends, my social network. All these sort of things that were sort of held me up for decades were now kind of caught. Those legs, support systems, were now chopped out from under me as I was trying to find my way in this difficult space. And it was kind of like it was what we call the dark night of the soul. And the dark night was a very difficult point, and it was kind of like being stuck in an escape room designed by Franz Kafka. And much to my surprise, it was psychedelics that helped me face my trauma more forthrightly, helped me grieve more efficiently and effectively, and it really helped me find room in my heart for forgiveness and compassion. And it didn't happen overnight, but it did with psychedelics in conjunction with traditional therapy, meditation, and other contemplative practices really sort of supercharged that healing adventure for me. And I'm very, very grateful for that. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that I got more insight from my first big psychedelic experience than I did from 20 years of being a monk. And the reason is pretty easy to explain, is that my ego was sort of, because of the abuse and trauma I had in the monastery, my ego was sort of trapped like a walnut, and I needed this cosmic nutcracker to expand my consciousness, break open my ego, and give me the mystical experiences that I was always looking for while I was a monk. Now, I did have some powerful mystical experiences in a traditional contemplative practice, but not at the same level as what I've experienced on various psychedelics. And yeah, so it still took a lot more therapy and journey work, but my PTSD symptoms are significantly alleviated from putting all these modalities together. Even though I have dark days, and I'm not perfect, and it doesn't mean I get everything right, God knows. But I can say that I am in a better space now than I was at that point. Now, the Enneagram is sort of like, well, what I say with this is that, like Achazo and Naranjo, right? So Achazo and Naranjo really are clear that a lot of their big ideas around the Enneagram came from their psychedelic explorations. And the same was true for me. I only recently uncovered the real psychedelic history of the Enneagram as I was researching my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. And before knowing about its roots, what I discovered something really groundbreaking. And this is, I think, an important idea that needs to be shared widely. What I discovered independently on my own is that psychedelics could predict, psychedelics in conjunction with the Enneagram could predict the flavor or tone of the psychedelic experiences people would have on a journey. So in observing people while they're on a psychedelic, if I knew their Enneagram type, I could predict what the flavor of what that experience, the highs and the lows for those people might be, and be able to help them more effectively integrate and process and even move through the experiences that they were having. And the reason is pretty simple, because the Enneagram tells us, according to our personality type, our Enneagram type, what our greatest unconscious fear is, and therefore what our greatest hope is, because they're just the inverse of each other, right? And so what I've discovered is that when people are having sort of difficult or negative psychedelic experiences, what's generally happening is some confrontation with their greatest fear according to their Enneagram type. And when they're having more positive, more elevated experiences, they're connecting with the greatest hope as determined by their Enneagram type. So knowing this makes pairing the Enneagram with psychedelic assisted therapy now can be a very, very useful tool for clinicians and practitioners and individuals as well, to be able to navigate, process, integrate, and even accelerate the healing potential of these psychoactive substances when used appropriately in the correct set and setting. Now think of it like this. So during a positive psychedelic experience, practitioners often describe being filled with a sense of divine love, which is infinite and unconditional. But here's the fascinating part. We notice that love rushing in and filling us up in the empty spaces where we're most broken. And the Enneagram can predict exactly where those spaces are. And so your Enneagram type is like, we're all getting this download, or whatever you want to call it, of this love that's flowing into us on the positive side. But we notice it in those empty spaces. And that's what influences the flavor or the general tone, not necessarily the specific imagery that will come up for people when they're journeying on various compounds. And what this discovery for me did is it validated the Enneagram's utility, because up to that point I was really kind of a skeptic. I didn't come into this as an Enneagram enthusiast, and even into this book. Just as a quick backstory, I've talked about this in other videos. But what I was trying to do in Taming Your Money Monster was to find an ethical system that would help people make better, healthier financial decisions, and an ethical system that would transcend religion, politics, and culture. I originally started working with two related theories. One's called spiral dynamics, and it's dovetailed that as integral theory. And I spent about 2 years trying to write this book, trying to help people figure out their money monsters using integral theory, spiral dynamics, and the Enneagram. And after 2 years of working on that project, I sent what I'd done up to that point to my publishers, and they're like, nope, no one's going to read that book. It's too complicated. It's too crazy. It worked, but it wasn't a book anyone was going to want to read. So I had to go back to the drawing board. And then I went fishing for some other system, and a good friend of mine was Richard Rohr, and he's been a friend of mine for 30 some odd years, and he taught me the basics of the Enneagram. But I was always still very skeptical of it, because even Richard Rohr and no one I'd ever met in the Enneagram community could explain why it worked. It felt very woo-woo to me, very esoteric, like, well, there's this mystical thing out there. Yeah, and I'm all into mysticism, don't get me wrong. But without a why it works, if you're telling me how my personality works, you should be able to tell me why. And that was something that I struggled with before I would really accept the Enneagram as a useful system to explain all parts of human behavior in all of it, make it a universal system that can be applied to all human beings. And seeing that the Enneagram explained every single psychedelic experience I was observing in others, including in myself, I said, oh, there was a light bulb. Okay, this thing is real. This thing is. And then that was when I went to my publisher and said, okay, well, how about we try the Enneagram and money? And like, yes. I said, what about psychedelics as well? And like, nope, can't mention that in the book. Okay, fine. We'll leave that part out. But it was, psychedelics were absolutely critical in writing Taming Your Money Monster, because a lot of the insights in the book, a lot of the big insights came, again, through the observational experiences that I was able, honored to witness. And then so you can imagine my astonishment after writing this book, finding out the connection between the Enneagram and psychedelics as a practical tool. And then only after the fact that I discovered that Gurdjieff, Chazo, and Naranjo were all psychonauts. It's like, what? Like, that just blew my mind. And so I kind of want to feel it's important that this history is out there in the world. But I also want to be very clear that psychedelics are not for everyone. They do carry significant risks. They should only be done in the appropriate set and setting, where legal. And there's a lot of underlying medical and health conditions that would preclude a number of people from ever wanting to explore in these directions. But for those who are called to them, who are mentally and physically healthy enough to venture into this territory, they can be accelerants for personal and spiritual development. Now, I've had a number of objections to people thinking that psychedelics can help you on your spiritual adventure. They call it a cheat or a hack, or it's a shortcut, or and there's no substitute for doing the work. You still got to integrate those experiences, and you need to be careful when using them. But I'll tell you a story. This is a story that kind of illustrates the point, and it's really a joke that Terence McKenna told about a man who lived by a river for many years and wanted to learn how to levitate and walk across water. And so he spent about 10 years of meditation and practice, and eventually he learned to levitate and walk across water. And then one day the Buddha came to his town, and he ran up to the Buddha and said, Master, look what I've done. I can levitate. I can walk across water. And the Buddha said, yeah, but the ferry only costs a nickel. And I think for many people who maybe got to advanced states the organic way, sitting in meditation for many, many decades, nothing wrong with that. But a lot of us don't have decades to spend sitting on a riverbank trying to figure this stuff up. And there's many people like myself who 20 years in a monastery, I gave it a can't say I didn't try. Let's put it that way. And I'm sure it was my fault, but I never really got to where I to the level of consciousness expansion in my traditional practice that people have been able to achieve through. I've been able to achieve through the appropriate use of psychedelics. And in my own experience, and having talked to many people who have organically gotten to that enlightenment state without these substances, if you give them a psychoactive substance and you ask them to compare, well, which one is there a difference? And the basic answer is there isn't any. The flavor might be a little different, but essentially it's the same core experience that people are having, that mystical union with something much higher and much broader and more powerful themselves. So look at my notes. Anyway, and so I think a lot of some folks are like the the guy who learned how to levitate across water, who either want to burn down the ferry, or there's people who are sitting on the riverbank trying to learn how to levitate, and they don't even see the ferry. It's like, why don't you just try that and see where that takes you? And you can always go back to meditation if you want to. In fact, you should, because you need both. Is a simple answer for me, and I think for those who are called to it. Now, here's the punchline of all of it, and where I think this is important is really the future of spirituality, the future of, I think, religion, and perhaps. What I've noticed, and I think many people would, perhaps you see this as well, is that many of our religious containers, many of our religious traditions and institutions have become very rigid, very calcified, very sclerotic, and they're almost like these beautiful cathedrals that are empty of any real authentic spiritual energy. And then on the flip side, we've got the psychedelic movement, which has tremendous spiritual energy, but no container to hold it, which leads to all kinds of bacchanalian excesses and all kinds of problems for people when you take things too far. And what I want to suggest in this video is that perhaps a solution is, what we really need to do is to take this energy, tremendous energy and power that we have in psychedelics, and put them back inside of our religious institutions, where there's a strong container that can hold them, and there's a community that can support people in their work. There's actually I'll give a shout out to Ligare, which is a Christian psychedelic society run by Hunt Priest, which I really admire their work, what they're doing. They're trying to do exactly that with Christianity. And I think other traditions could benefit from that as well. But the Enneagram can really be the tool that brings those two worlds together, because the Enneagram is a non-sectarian, non-denominational spiritual tool that works across all faith traditions, because it's the underlying mechanics of the human consciousness. It's the physics of consciousness. And I go into this in great depth in other videos, and in my book, check out Taming Your Money Monsters for more depth on this topic. But essentially, if we can wed our existing spiritual traditions with the Enneagram and psychedelics, we have a powerful triple threat, if you will, that could really revivify the spiritual adventure for the current generation and for many, many, many generations to come. Okay, I think that's as much as I want to cover in this video for today. But I do want to cover in the next video what I'm going to talk about is, and this is the next bit of exciting, very exciting breakthroughs I've come up with, is that you can. Not only does the Enneagram help you predict the flavor of your psychedelic experiences, it can also predict which psychedelic medicines in particular you're most likely to gravitate towards and find most beneficial, which is really wild. And I'll go into that in more depth in the next video. And but stay tuned. But if you're enjoying any of this content, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That would be a big favor for me. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care.